Oh, righty now. Hello, everyone. I think it's the 14th of November. Welcome to This and That. Going to continue on today with a little bit more reading from the new translation of Marx's Volume 1 of Capital. But before I do that, I wanted to point out just a few things. Um, I'm going to begin talking about this diagram here, and you've seen this diagram before, but it is an important one in terms of trying to explain what's going on in Capital and in Volume 1. I also wanted to scroll down here to the end of the thing and point out a few other things. Uh, yeah, it's going to take us a couple of days to get through this first chapter, but I included a paper that Mosley wrote on chapter 1, and it's important because it is about the whatever controversies exist in the present form, and it is about this value form interpretation. Chapter 1 is the most important chapter in Capital, as well as the most difficult and the most controversial. An influential interpretation of Chapter 1 in recent decades has been the so-called value form interpretation of Marxist theory in general, and Chapter 1 in particular. Mosley has written an entire book on Chapter 1. The most important proponent of the value form interpretation today, both in Germany and in the English-speaking world, is Michael Heinrich, and Heinrich's work has emphasized the first chapter. Heinrich's latest book in English is a detailed commentary of the first 7 chapters of Volume 1 of Capital. He's also done one on all 3 volumes. The publication of an English translation of Heinrich's book is an important event in Marxian scholarship, and it's important to critically engage with this book, etc. The book emphasizes the quantitative issue of whether the magnitude of value and socially necessary labor time are determined in production or also depend on exchange and demand, which has been the main issue in the controversy over the value form interpretation. That one sentence describes, a couple of years of spilling ink and a bunch of other things. But if we recall, now that we're in Volume 2, it is the difference between Department 1 and Department 2. And with all due respect, Heinrich, doesn't want to make that connection. Well, on the one hand, he is making the connection, but he's doing it in a way that isn't fully articulated. And I think that's what Mosley's trying to do, is to say, listen, if you believe in an exchange level thing, then you also have to talk about supply-demand issues. And Heinrich is not doing that. So that's the critique in a nutshell of what has been spent a couple of years, screwing around with this argument. That is, you have Department 1, Department 2, there's exchange. Exchange helps to establish questions of value, and that's Heinrich's position. It's a good position. It's just that you need to sort of push it a little further, and what constitutes, explaining value, especially when you're starting with, you're spending all this time on chapter 1. And so, needless to say, Mosley's patient exegesis of chapter 1 in this book, this is the book by Mosley on the entire, just on chapter 1. It's 160 pages on just chapter 1. Unlikely to supplant or replace Heinrich's interpretation among young readers. What it does do is provide a systematic rebuttal of that reading for those willing to confront the daunting difficulties of Marxist theory head-on, rather than accept a revised and misleading version of it. So the argument here, of course, is that from the reviewer, Smith, he's saying that, well, Heinrich isn't giving us anything more to work with. And, you could say that stuff like the new book by Soren Mao doesn't quite do that either. And you can just keep going on and on. How do we resolve that? Well, I think that we resolve this by approaching ways in which we can connect discourse on value, whether it's an extreme version of the value question or ignoring it, which others do. The analytic form, the analytic Marxism form tries to actually ignore it in many ways. You need to sort of get through this and be open. I think the whole question of open Marxism, as it were, is really important to discuss in this particular context, partially because, we're dealing with it in the English language and et cetera, et cetera. So let's go back to, sort of the Harvey Cleaver sort of arguing about how chapter 1 occurs. What Moseley reminds us, and it is, of course, his way of linking the modern monetary theory to it, is to remind us that part 1 in chapter 1, in volume 1, is called Commodities and Money. So money is still important in chapter 1. It's just that he hasn't gotten there yet. That's all. As we've read through this, we've had sparse mention of money, but eventually we get there. And if you follow the diagram for the argument for volume 1, it's pretty logical, actually. It is actually logical, assuming you start with the concept of commodity, which is an abstract value, and clearly the issue of use and exchange value is important to Heinrich. And the connected issue of what counts as socially necessary labor time is what we were currently reading up to. And it is still structured by a difference between, and I think hopefully you got that from yesterday's reading, is to identify what the differences are between concrete and abstract labor. There's labor, but it can be differentiated in a variety of ways, some of which are more obvious, more material than others. And this is the thing that I've been scrabbling around with, as you've sort of been noticing when we talk about general intellect and the Grundrisse and blah, 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 blah. We're trying to account for what are elements of abstract labor. How concrete is it? We could say that the brain cranks out, X amount of blood and blah, blah, blah. And that's one way of thinking about what the brain does. But what the brain does is not necessarily what the mind does. And then you get off into a whole bunch of other stuff. But the fact is, action in the world, stuff we do, it's not purely instinctual. We do actually think about what we do, often not very well. And that's kind of what's going on. So abstract and concrete labor come back together again. And we see that it does that in forms of exchange value, which is the Heinrich position, writ small, let's put it that way. And so Heinrich is actually quite, I don't know if you want to call him conservative, but, he's reading it in the original German. He's trying to make that kind of connection, and how we discuss questions of where we are now is the issue of what counts as equivalent form and relative form. And I know that maybe, they seem synonymous, which is, problematic in and of itself. Whereas if you think logically, an equivalent form is something that is more identical than something that is relative. I hope you can sort of see that, right? And we're looking at things which we would, sort of value as equivalents, going all the way back to this notion, overarching idea of commodity. Now, where it does head eventually is to money form. That is, the money is both signifies the equivalence of things, but also shows a relative connection, which is problematic because it's more abstract. You see, it actually all connects here. And so if you move down to the second row here, where money form continues, we can see that even described up till now, which is that sort of front loading that Marx does, is that we're signifying social relations between things. Now, between things is not the same as between persons. And so we're going to see that there's this idea of the social relation between things and the material relation between persons. So we have another set of differences that describes, how we think about money. Trump doesn't believe necessarily in social relations. He only sort of reduces them down to certain material relations. That is, how much is whatever this relation is going to be worth. So, for example, the worthiness, as it were, of RFK Jr. being in charge of national health is another problematic element, because it is barely about social relations. It's more about material relations. That is, opposing certain elements which represent to a guy with a worm in his head, you know, something problematic. So market exchange is a subsequent product of those things, because that's what the market is about, right? Money, stuff, caring more about people than things, or things rather than people. That's kind of what's going on here. And then, of course, the market itself, that is owners and sellers, and then the money commodity, that is, the money is a form, right? You sort of think of, well, X amount of bucks, which has this price thing sort of sitting in the back of your head. Well, once you start working through, exchanges that transfer ownership, that is between buyers and sellers, money then becomes a commodity. It mediates the relationship among all of these things: people, concepts, hoarding stuff. So the money commodity is a measure of value versus being just simply something that circulates crap. So we're back to money again, but we're at money not as a form or beyond form in that sense, or whatever. And let's bring it down to the third row here. Then money, we begin to see, is manipulated, not just simply because it's circulating and valuing things, but rather because of property. People become debtors and creditors. And this is where, as with volume 3 and X number of future yakking, is debt versus credit, which help to create capital. Capital includes all that other crap, objects and land and, whatever. Where it's problematic for Marx is whether people are capital. So that's a whole thing. Because some people actually don't give a crap about, people in that particular context. So there is this value in process and profit thing that is complicated, difficult, and as I think, Marx tries to solve this in the first chapter, not solve it, at least point out, well, okay, there's a relative version of it, and then there's an abstract version of it. They're not identical. They're commingled in a certain weird way, but you can see that all of this is measured against time and nature and space and a bunch of other stuff. And all of these are about, or at least for Marx, from a value point of view, is the buying and selling of labor power. Not labor itself, but potentiality or expectations about labor. And so the ultimate difference, that is the antagonism, class struggle, it's between capital and labor. Capital thinks they should maximize, whatever they're going to get out of you. And labor goes, well, I don't think so. And what's it worth to you? Blah, blah, blah. So, needless to say, inequality, non-equivalence, that's important. For libertarians, that's equivalence that, it doesn't really quite matter. They're still about hoarding. Get as much as you can. Unless you think that's unimportant, that's kind of what's going on right now in politics. So I hopefully you can follow this. This is probably as simple a diagram as you could get, but it really kind of describes most of the things. So you go, across the top, commodity to money form to money, money to class struggle. And it's not based on money. It's just simply that, money is one stop in this kind of putting value together. So anyway, we started reading this darn thing, and I know that it maybe still seems tedious, but Marx is trying to do this as a philosopher as logically as he thinks he can. He's a very German And one of the tasks for the translators is to sort of go, well, okay, but it's kind of tedious. So let's start at 4. Simple value form in its entirety. A commodity's simple value form is contained in its value relation with a different kind of commodity. That is, its exchange relation with such a commodity. Commodity A, its value is expressed qualitatively by the circumstance that commodity B can be directly exchanged for commodity A. It's expressed quantitatively by the circumstance that a certain quantity of B can be directly exchanged for a given quantity of A. In other words, the commodity's value expressed independently when it is represented as an exchange value. The commodity is both a use value and an exchange value. Readers will call that line, which uses today's terminology from the beginning of the chapter. But the line is wrong, strictly speaking. The commodity is both a use value, that is a useful object, and a value, a big V value. It is represented as the double something. That is, that it is the moment its value acquires the form of exchange value, a form of appearance of its own, different from the commodity's natural form. And now that alone, that sentence is really, kind of complicated, but it's not very complicated. It just happens to have a multiplicity of meaning. And for some people, that's troubling. It already is. That sense of difference is what motivates people in terrible ways. Why is it that some people dress like whores? Whatever. And what counts as that? What are the signifiers of that? Is it the fishnet stockings? Whatever. But a commodity never has that form when viewed in isolation. Rather, it has the form of exchange value only within a value relation or exchange relation with a second commodity of a different type. It's sort of the plot of Pretty Woman. If one keeps this in mind, it is harmless to say what we said earlier. It's just shorthand. It's just shorthand. Our analysis has shown that the value form or commodity value expression arises from the nature of commodity value, rather than the reverse. That is, value and magnitude of value don't arise from their mode of expression as exchange value. Yet the mercantilists and their modern epigones, such as Ferrier, Goneth, and others, subscribe to this crazy notion, as do their polar opposites. That is, the modern salesmen of free trade, such as Bastiat and his lot. The mercantilists focus above all on the qualitative side of the expression of value, and therefore the commodity's equivalent form whose fully developed shape is money. What are you going to lose by voting for big orange, sort of horrible person? Modern free trade peddlers, in contrast, focus on the quantitative side of the relative value form, needing as they do to unload their commodities at any price. It follows that neither value nor a commodity's magnitude of value exists for them except as expressed by relations of exchange, or, that is, as a list of the day's stock prices. Now, note that people do that, right? The S&P 500, etc. In attempting to dress up the incoherent views of Lombard Street in the most learned attire, the Scotsman MacLeod managed to create a synthesis of the superstitious mercantilists and the enlightened peddlers of free trade. When we look closely at the value expression of commodity A, contained in A's value relation with commodity B, we saw that within that relation, A's natural form counts as nothing but a shape of use value, and B's natural form counts only as a value form or value shape. So there's this resemblance, but maybe something that's not palpable. The internal opposition between use value and value encased in the commodity is represented then as an external opposition. It's represented through the relation between the two commodities, where the one commodity whose value is to be expressed directly counts as nothing but use value, while the other, through which value is to be expressed, directly counts as nothing but exchange value. That's, you know, like watching the infomercial and then finally getting to how much is this actually going to cost and how many payments is it? A commodity is simple value form is thus a simple form of appearance of its internal opposition. That is use value versus value. This is big V value. And I think that in the translation, you always get this problem of, okay, well, there's use value and exchange value. And then there's these sentences, these phrases that oppose use value and big V value. And I think it's really important to remember that exchange value is subordinated in this expression. It's still there. You haven't lost it. It's there. And in fact, it makes big V value. So without going through a whole exercise about, well, where in the original text does Marx oppose use value versus value as opposed to assuming that use value and exchange value are oppositions, but, you know, they're assimilated to the same big thing, big V value. I just want to remind you of that because I think even in this translation, they don't quite get to that point, which I think they should, or maybe they do in a footnote and haven't really figured it out. Labor products have been useful objects in all stages of society, but they were transformed into commodities only in a historically specific epoch of development, where the labor expended to make a use thing came to be represented as the objective property of that thing, namely its value. It is what you might distinguish between, you know, pre-feudal primitive society and feudalism. And you begin to have, you know, money occurs throughout this entire period, but, you know, there's a heck of a lot of barter. There's a lot of other stuff going on, and you don't have larger scale currency systems to sort of work through that. No, and that's the kind of standard history, right? You know, it follows that a commodity's simple value form is at the same time a labor product's simple commodity form, and also that the development of the commodity form coincides with that of the value form. So I suppose we could talk about food production as that same kind of thing. That is relative to restaurants. You know, you can sort of get the sense of how much labor and technique went into the, you know, production of food, and it is a commodity because you have to pay for it eventually. And that, you know, there are these sort of unifications of those ideas. We can recognize at a glance the inadequacy of the simple value form, the embryonic form that matured into the price form only by metamorphosing a number of times. When commodity A's value is expressed through this or that commodity B, A's value is distinguished only from its own use value, and so expressing A's value in this way only puts A into an exchange relation with an individual commodity of a type different from A. So it really doesn't represent A's qualitative equality with or quantitative proportionality to all other commodities. I know that sounds sort of confusing, but, you know, when you get your hamburger, you know, is my Whopper equivalent to a quarter pounder? Well, no, it isn't supposed to be equivalent to a Big Mac or whatever the hell that means. One commodity's individual equivalent form corresponds to the simple relative form of a single different commodity. Thus, in linen's relative value expression, the coat has the equivalent form or the form of direct exchangeability with regard to this one kind of commodity alone, the linen. Here, nevertheless, the individual value form turns into a more complete form on its own. Of course, the value of commodity A is still expressed only through one other commodity of a different kind. But it doesn't matter at all which kind, coats, iron, wheat, so on. Depending on whether a commodity enters into a value relation with this or that commodity, different simple expressions of its value, of the value of one and the same commodity will arise. Impossible Burgers, for example. How many ways there are to express its value is limited only by how many different kinds of commodities there are. A commodity's isolated value expression is thus transformed into the indefinitely extendable series of its different simple value expressions. So we're on to B now, the total or expanded value form. So Z commodity A equals U commodity B, or V commodity C, or W equals commodity D, or equals X commodity E, or etc. That is 20 yards of linen equals a coat. Or it could equal 10 pounds of tea, or 40 pounds of coffee, or 8 bushels of wheat, or 2 ounces of gold, or half a ton of iron, or whatever. So what we see here is that you have a kind of equivalence, but you also expand the equivalence because there's something that can connect all these things, and obviously money to assess, how you're going to assess it is, and that's where the abstraction comes in, right? Because you go, well, it's not really kind of worth that much. It's not worth that much to me anyway, and I don't have that much money, or I don't have that much money in my pocket. All right, number one, the expanded relative value form, a commodity's value, the linens, for example, is now expressed with countless other members of the commodity world. Physical body of every other commodity becomes a mirror of the linen's value. And so its value truly begins to appear as a gelatinous blob of undifferentiated human labor. What he's trying to describe here is that, you need some way, some constant, some thing that you can measure everything against. Now, the fact is it sits in your little brain, and, it's not quite the same as somebody else's standardized thought in their little brain. So for the labor that makes up this value is now, and labor is one way of getting at the problem, but, you can do it in a variety of other ways. But, for the moment, that's what we're doing. For the labor that makes up this value is now expressly represented as labor that counts as equal to all other human labor, whatever natural form that other labor has, and thus whether it is objectified in a coat or wheat or iron or gold or something else. Owing to its value form, the linen is now in a social relation with the whole commodity world, and no longer just one different type of commodity. As a commodity, it is a citizen of that world. At the same time, the endless series of the linen's expression of value shows that for a commodity value, the particular form of use value through which it appears doesn't really matter at all. 20 yards of linen equals a coat. In this first form, it might be purely accidental that the two commodities can be exchanged in a certain quantitative ratio. In the second form, in contrast, the background that determines and also differs essentially from this accidental appearance shines through right away. The linen's magnitude of value remains the same, whether represented as a coat, coffee, iron, or countless other commodities belonging to owners of the most diverse ilk. The accidental relation of two individual commodity owners falls away. What becomes clear is that exchange doesn't regulate the magnitude of a commodity's value, but rather that the reverse is true. A commodity's magnitude of value regulates its relations of exchange. Okay, now that sounds confusing, but this magnitude of value is my example of, I got to go in the store, there's stuff I like, and I find something that I like. Then I go over to the clearance table and see if I can find something that's like that, because then it'll have a slightly lower price. And so the magnitude of value determines whether I'm going to buy the damn thing or whether it's worth buying. And that's why I probably spend too much time fussing around in stores. I don't really, but it only seems that way. And worse if you're actually with me shopping. The particular equivalent form, every commodity, a coat, tea, wheat, iron, counts in the linen's expression of value as the equivalent, and thus as a value dash body, that is value body. The particular natural form of each of these commodities is now a particular equivalent form among many others. Likewise, the diverse, particular, concrete, useful kinds of labor contained in the various physical commodity bodies now count as so many particular forms of realization or forms of appearance of human labor as such. Now, as I tried to mention yesterday, this is why plastic often disguises this appearance question. It looks shiny, it looks this or that or whatever, it looks more solid, looks like it's going to survive, a certain type of activity, and it sucks usually. That's the problem of, plastic things. On the other hand, there are plastics that are as durable as any other, like steel, but Most people don't make them like that. The whole point of plastic was to substitute in that sense. The shortcomings of the total or expanded value form. First, a commodity's relative value expression remains incomplete because the series of things through which it can be represented never ends. The chain in which one value equation gives way to another can be extended indefinitely, as each new kind of commodity provides the material for a new expression of value. Second, what takes shape here is a colorful mosaic of unconnected and diverse value expressions. If in the end, the relative value of every commodity is expressed in this expanded form, as is inevitable, then every commodity's relative value form is an endless series of value expressions different from the relative value form of every other commodity. The shortcomings of the expanded relative value form are reflected in the equivalent form that goes with it. Here, the natural form of every individual kind of commodity is a particular equivalent form among countless others. So there are only limited equivalent forms, each of which excludes all the others. Similarly, the specific concrete useful kind of labor that every commodity equivalent contains is only one particular form through which human labor appears, and thus it's not an exhaustive one. Human labor has its complete or total form of appearance in the totality of its particular form of appearance, of course. But this also means that it doesn't have a single unified form of appearance. Let me break there for a second and say, okay, well, this analogy may not go where I need it to go, but okay, there's this thing in the world called a burger, which is essentially a flat patty of ground meat. Now, the fact is, these can be of a variety of composition, right? Pork, beef, swordfish, whatever, chicken, all of these burger things, are problematic in the sense that, well, I don't know, is that a real fish cake or is it not fish, but rather, or a crab cake? Let's say it's a crab cake. Is that a real crab cake or is it a constructed, reconstituted pollock or whatever? And those are the kinds of issues that you begin to start asking, particularly if you're in a store trying to make this kind of weird decision. And it always, if you're stupid like me, you go, well, let's see what the cost per dollar per ounce is. And then you look at the little thing on the label and it either is good or is bad or just shocks you to no end. Anyway, back to the text. The expanded relative value form is made up entirely, in any case, of an aggregation of simple relative value expressions or equations of the first type of form, such as, back to the original form, to 20 yards of linen equals a coat, 20 yards of linen equals 10 pounds of tea, etc. Each of these equations also implies the identical equation in reverse, that is, 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen, and 10 pounds of tea equals 20 pounds of linen. And you can see that in a simple algebraic sense, that coats could equal tea as well, right? I give you 10 pounds of tea, or I think about 10 pounds of tea and what that is. And yes, sometimes you actually make that calculation in your little brain when you're in the store. It's like, well, do I want one of these, or I can feed my kids for an extra week on this other stuff, whatever. In fact, if someone were to exchange his linen for many other commodities, therefore thereby expressing its value through a series of other commodities, then many other commodity owners would necessarily be exchanging their commodities for linen, thereby expressing the value of various commodities from one and the same third commodity, that is linen. Thus, if we reverse the series, that is 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat or 10 pounds of tea, et cetera, that is, if we express the reverse relation already implied in the series, we get number C, the general value form. And I'll stop for a second and say, okay, well, from the Grundrisse, we get the same sort of idea, right? That you have all this other stuff going on, but in mental energy, and you couldn't get to a general intellect in the same value context. Oh, yeah, and that's an aside. C, the general value form. So 1 coat equals 10 pounds of tea, equals 40 pounds of coffee, equals 8 bushels of wheat, equals 2 ounces of gold, equals half a ton of iron, equals X commodity A, and so on. And they all equal 20 yards of linen. The changed character of the value form. Commodities now represent their value simply because through a single commodity, and also in the same way because through the same commodity. Their value form is simple, and they share the same one. It is therefore general. Forms 1 and 2 served only to express a commodity's value as something distinct from its own use value or physical commodity body. The first form, 1, yielded value equations such as 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen, 10 pounds of tea, etc. The coat value is expressed as something equal to linen. The tea value is something equal to iron, and so on. But these value expressions, the coat and the tea, I know this is very simple math, right? Something equal to linen and something equal to iron are just as different as linen and iron, of course. Clearly, this form only occurs in the very beginning stages where accidental and occasional exchanges transform labor products into commodities. You can say that's what happens in barter, right? You know, you take your cow into town, you know, and get, you know, important stuff rather than the beans that this peddler sold you, whatever. The second form, 2, distinguishes a commodity's value from its own use value more adequately than the first form 1 does, because it's now through all possible forms that the coat's value, for example, faces its natural form as something equal to linen, something equal to iron, something equal to tea, and so on, as everything except something equal to a coat. On the other hand, a common value expression for commodities is directly excluded, since now in the value expression of any one commodity, every other commodity appears only in the form of the equivalent. The expanded value form truly emerges only once. It is customary or no longer unusual for a labor product, let's say cattle, to be exchanged for other various commodities. This newly attained form expresses the value of the whole commodity world through a single kind of commodity set apart from the rest, that is linen. You know, for example, representing the values of all the other commodities through their being equal to that one commodity. You know, that as something equal to linen, the value of every other commodity is now distinguished not only from its own use value, but from all use value. And in just this way, the value of every commodity is expressed as what is common to all commodities. It is thus this form that actually brings all commodities into relation with one another as values that allows them to present themselves to one another as exchange values. The 2 earlier forms, that is form 1 and form 2, express the value of an individual commodity one at a time, either through a single commodity of another type or through a series of many such commodities. In both cases, it is an individual commodity's private business, so to speak, to give itself a value form. A commodity achieves this without help from the other commodities, which play the merely passive role of the equivalent here. The general value form, in contrast, can arise only as the commodity world's common project. A commodity acquires a general value expression only when all other commodities simultaneously express their value through the same equivalent, something that every new kind of commodity will have to do. What this brings into view is that because the value objecthood of commodities is merely the social existence of these things, it can be expressed only through the range of their social relations. And so their value form must be a socially valid form. In other words, once I'm looking for stuff, I suddenly decide, well, I'm in a shopping mall and the Marshalls is similar to the whatever Max, and I'll go over there and see if the same stuff is available, either by the same producer or something similar, whatever. Okay, in the form of something equal to the linen, all commodities appear not only as qualitative equal somethings or values as such, but also as quantitative comparable magnitudes of value. Now, because their magnitudes of value are reflected in the mirror of one and the same material, that is linen, these magnitudes mirror one another. For example, 10 pounds of tea equals 20 yards of linen, and 40 pounds of coffee equals 20 yards of linen. So 10 pounds of tea equals 40 pounds of coffee, ipso facto. Or Embedded in a pound of coffee is only a quarter as much value substance, i.e. labor, as there is in a pound of tea. Now, that's a very primitive, piece of math there and incredibly problematic, but, you sort of get where he's headed. The general relative value form of the commodity world impresses the character of a universal equivalent on the linen, the equivalent commodity excluded from that world. The linen's own natural form becomes the commodity world's common value shape, and thus the linen can be directly exchanged for all the other commodities. Its physical form now counts as the visible incarnation, the general social chrysalis state of all human labor. Weaving, the private labor that produces the linen, has at the same time a general social form, the form of being equal to all other kinds of labor. The general value form is made up of the countless equations that, one after the other, equate the labor realized in the linen with the labor contained in every other commodity, thereby turning weaving into the general form of appearance of human labor as such. Not only is the labor objectified in a commodity value represented negatively, or as labor from which all the concrete forms and useful qualities of actual instances of labor has been abstracted away, but its positive nature is expressly revealed. That is, it is the reduction of all actual instances of labor to their common character as human labor, to an expenditure of human labor power. So you can see the degree of abstraction going on here. The general value form represents labor products as bare, gelatinous blobs of undifferentiated human labor, and its own structure shows that it's the social expression of the commodity world. This form thus shows that within the commodity world, labor's general human characteristic constitutes its specific social character. So the point I raised yesterday about, well, how do we know that something is fair trade? What would tell us that that's fair trade? The fact that it costs more or costs less, which is an interesting problem in and of itself. Is the price the only signifier, or is it the label, or is it the company that makes these, or is it the place of origin where the beans come from? Is it really about the beans, or is it more about the roasters or whatever? The interdependent development of the relative value form and the equivalent form. How much the equivalent form has developed corresponds to how developed the relative value form is. But in fact, and let's note this well, the equivalent form's development simply expresses and results from the development of the relative value form. One commodity's simple or isolated relative value form makes another commodity into an individual equivalent. The expanded form of relative value, or the expression of one commodity's value through all other commodities, recasts these other commodities in the form of diverse particular equivalents. Finally, one particular kind of commodity attains the form of a general equivalent because all other commodities make it into the material of their uniform general value form. As all this wordiness is, eventually something connects all these suckers, and there is some way in which we can generalize these sorts of things. If you're fixing your car and you're confronted, or at least have the capability, which you don't usually have, of comparing the original equipment manufacturer version of the part versus some other thing which looks like identical, but is made, somewhere else, and you don't really, and you may not even know that other somewhere else or that brand or whatever. You have to think about what are these things that are going to survive. I had to replace a headlight assembly, and I'm sad to say that the range of price, and if I were being an idiot, not even the original equipment manufacturer version was $125, and one which pretty much did the same thing, had holes in all the right places. The one I bought was like $25. So $100 went, and my little brain goes somewhere. But as the value form as such develops, the opposition between its poles, that is the relative value form and the equivalent form, develops too, and to the same degree. Even form 1, that is 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, contains this opposition, although it isn't yet fixed there. If the same equation is read forward and then backward, each of the two commodity poles, that is linen and coats, will switch positions, going either from the relative value form to the equivalent form or the other way around. It still takes effort to keep the polar opposition fixed. In form 2, different kinds of commodities can fully expand their relative value only one at a time. Only one commodity has the expanded relative value form. That is because, and insofar as all the other commodities occupy the equivalent form in their interactions with this one commodity, we can no longer flip around the two sides of the value equation, such as 20 yards of linen and 1 coat, or 10 pounds of tea, or 8 bushels of wheat, without altering its whole character and changing it from the total value form to the general value form. The last form, form 3, finally gives the commodity a social relative value form that qualifies as general. And this happens because, and insofar as all commodities are excluded from the general equivalent form, with one exception. That is, one commodity, the linen, comes to have a form in which it can be directly exchanged for all the other commodities. That is a directly social form because, and insofar as the other commodities do not occupy that form. Conversely, the commodity that functions as the general equivalent is excluded from the commodity world's uniform and therefore general relative value form. If the linen, in other words, some commodity occupying the general equivalent form, were to partake of the general relative value form at the same time, it would have to serve as its own equivalent. We would then wind up with a tautology, that is 20 yards of linen equals 20 yards of linen, that expresses neither value nor magnitude of value. In order to express the general equivalent's relative value, we need instead to invert form 3. This equivalent doesn't share a relative value form with all commodities. Rather, its value expresses itself relatively through the endless series. That is, the physical bodies of all other commodities. Thus, the expanded relative value form of form 2 now appears as the equivalent commodity's relative specific relative value form. He's just saying, there's a transitivity problem that doesn't always quite follow through. And it is this idea that we're increasing the degree of abstraction by trying to seek some abstraction that helps to accommodate, that helps to create value, to create the little big V value in your head. The transition from the general value form, and you see, that's where we that's where money comes in. We finally got the money. The transition from the general value form to the money form. General equivalent form is a form of value as such, which means that any commodity can have it. On the other hand, a commodity can occupy the general equivalent form, form 3, only when, and insofar as all other commodities have excluded that commodity from their ranks, thereby making it into their equivalent. Only once this exclusion has been definitely restricted to one specific kind of commodity will the commodity world's uniform relative value form, now truly established, acquire general social validity. That's really a long way to talking about, well, money is a proxy for, all this crap, this cogitating about value. A specific kind of commodity, a commodity whose natural form becomes socially intertwined with the equivalent form, emerges as the money commodity or functions as money. So we were talking about, Prof. John was talking about, Nancy was talking about blocks of stone, which had a certain kind of value. Although when you read the kind of the narrative around it, it was less about money so much as it sort of signified some other status element as well. You would drag it around to ceremonies and put in front of your house, or whatever. To play the role of the general equivalent is this commodity's specific social function, and so it has a social monopoly on that role within the commodity world. Among the commodities that figure as linen's specific equivalents in Form 2 and all express their relative value through the linen in Form 3, one particular commodity has a history of capturing and holding on to this privileged position, namely gold. If we replace the commodity linen with the commodity gold in Form 3, we get, in fact, the money form. So 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat equals 10 pounds of tea, blah, 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 equals 2 ounces of gold. That was a lot of work to get to, okay, well, money is used as a kind of proxy to, it's a medium of exchange and has a store of value and blah, blah, blah. All of those things are there. And we've grown up thinking that gold has, because of its scarcity, has that particular quality. And it signifies that certainly by the fact that it's very pure. You can use it to, you can put it in people's mouths, whatever. It has a certain degree of purity to it. And so in that sense, it has a certain durability, let's put it that way. Fundamental changes take place during the transition from Form 1 to Form 2 and then from Form 2 to Form 3. In contrast, Form 4 doesn't differ at all from Form 3, except that the commodity that has the form, the general equivalent, is now gold rather than linen. Gold is in Form 4 what the linen was in Form 3, that is the general equivalent. The only progress that has occurred is that owing to social convention, the form in which a commodity can be directly exchanged for any other commodity, in other words, the general equivalent form, has become definitively intertwined with the specific natural form of a particular commodity, namely gold. Gold now functions as money in its interaction with all the other commodities, only because it has previously interacted with them as a commodity. Like all other commodities, it too had functioned as an equivalent, whether it's the individual equivalent in isolated exchange transactions, or it's one particular commodity equivalent alongside others. Gradually began to act in larger or smaller circles as the general equivalent. The moment that gold seized the monopoly on this role in the commodity world's value expression, it became the money commodity. And then, or only after that had happened, so did Form 4 become to differ from Form 3. Only then was the general value form transformed into the money form. When a commodity's simple relative value expression, such as linen, is put in terms of the commodity already functioning as the money commodity, such as gold, we have the price form. Price form, this is the first occurrence of that concept. Hence, the price form of linen, 20 yards of linen equals 2 ounces of gold. So, if 2 ounces of gold, when coined, are 2 pounds, that's where it gets confusing, of course. $2, let's say. 20 yards of linen is $2, whatever. The concept of the money form presents one challenge, namely to grasp the general equivalent form and thus the general value form as such, Form 3. By working backward, we can reduce Form 3 to Form 2, the expanded value form, and its constitutive element is Form 1. That is, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or commodity X commodity A equals Y commodity B. The simple commodity form is therefore the seed of the money form. So this is connecting in the little chart I have there. There's a commodity. It has form. It is the seed for getting to money. Now, needless to say, there are other variations on this because it's not as simple as all that, although I think even reading it this way would be terrible for some kid. This is not clear enough, and probably it needs to be in a sort of Barney-like diagram of some kind. Fetish character of commodities and the secret it entails. A commodity seems at first glance like an obvious, trivial thing. However, when we analyze it, we see that it is very intricate, full of metaphysical quibbles and theological quirks. To the extent that a commodity is a use value, there's nothing mysterious about it. Whether I do it as something whose properties satisfy human wants or needs, or something that has those properties only as the product of human labor. Anyone can see that human activity modifies natural materials so as to make them useful to people. We modify the form of wood, for example, when we use it to build a table. Of course, the table isn't any less made up of wood for having been worked on, and the wood remains an ordinary, sensuous thing. But the moment the table starts to act as a commodity. It metamorphoses into a sensuous, super sensuous thing. It doesn't simply stand before us with its feet on the ground. Rather, in its relation with all other commodities, it turns upside down and spins bizarre notions out of its blocky head, a performance far more fantastic than if it were to start dancing of its own accord. Thus, the commodity's mystical character doesn't arise from its use value. It also doesn't arise from that which constitutes the determinant of value. For however diverse, useful labor or productive activity it may be, it is at first a physiological fact that the varieties of useful labor are functions of the human organism, and that every such function, whether its purpose and form, is essentially the exertion of a human brain, nerves, muscle, sensory organs, and so on. Second, with regard to how the magnitude of value is determined, that is, for example, how long an exertion lasts or how much labor is expended, the quantity of labor is manifestly different from its quality. Under all conditions, people have had to think about how much labor time is needed to produce their means of subsistence, although not to the same degree in all stages of development. Finally, the labor people carry out also takes on a social form as soon as they begin to work for one another in some way. The moment a labor product assumes the commodity form, it has an enigmatic character, which comes from where? From this form itself, clearly. The equality existing among different kinds of human labor takes on the thingly form of labor products, equal value objecthood. Duration, as the measure of expended human labor power, takes on the form of labor products, magnitudes of value, and the relation among the producers themselves, within which the social characteristics of their labor are activated, take on the form of the social relation among labor products. The mystery of the commodity form amounts then simply to this: that is, the form reflects back at people the social characteristics of their own labor as objective characteristics of their labor products, as socio-natural properties of those things. And so the commodity form also reflects back at people the producer's relation to the totality of labor as a social relation among objects that exist apart from and outside the producers themselves. Through this quid pro quo, labor products become commodities, sensuous, supersensuous, or social things. Similarly, the impression a thing makes on the optic nerve isn't perceived as a subjective stimulation of that nerve, but rather as the objective form of a thing external to the eye. This is, of course, a physical relation between physical things, with the light from one thing, the external object, actually hitting one another, the eye. This is the problem of driving up to the fast food restaurant. In contrast, the commodity form has nothing to do with labor's products' physical nature, the thing-to-thing relation arising from it. And the same holds for the value relation of labor products within which that form is expressed. Here, it's only a particular social relation among people that assumes for those people themselves the phantasmagoric form of a relation among things. To find an analogy, we have to travel into the misty place that is the religious world, where things produced by the human mind seem endowed with lives of their own. They seem to be autonomous figures interacting with one another and human beings. So it is in the commodity world, too, but with things produced by human hands. I call this fetishism. Labor products become fetishes the moment they're produced as commodities. And this fetishism is thus inseparable from commodity production. Hence the whole necessity for advertising, or witch doctors, whatever, however you want to, stuff happens. As our analysis has already shown, the commodity world's fetish character arises from the particular social character of the labor that produces commodities. Useful products can become commodities only because they're made by instances of private labor carried out independently of one another. The aggregation of these instances constitutes a social totality of labor, because producers don't come into social contact with one another until they exchange their labor products. It also happens that the specific social characteristics of their instances of private labor first appear within an exchange transaction. In other words, instances of private labor appear within an exchange transaction. the crafts fair, for example. In other words, instances of private labor come to operate as components of a social totality of labor due to the relations that exchange establishes among labor producers and with the products mediating among their producers. Thus, to the producers, the social relations of their instances of private labor appear not as direct social relations in which human beings are connected by their work, but as what is in fact the case here. That is, things mediate the relations among people, while there are social relations among things. Only when they're exchanged do labor products acquire an equal social value objecthood that is distinct from their physically diverse use objecthood. This division of the labor product into a useful thing and a value thing isn't truly activated until exchange has proliferated enough and becomes sufficiently important for useful things to be made for the purpose of exchange. And thus, their value character comes into consideration as far back as when they're produced. The moment that exchange is caught on widely enough, the producer's instances of private labor gain a double social character. On the one hand, as particular instances of useful labor, they must satisfy a particular social want or need and thereby, maintain their respective position as part of the totality of labor. That is, the spontaneously arising social division of labor. On the other hand, useful instances of private labor satisfy their producers' diverse wants and needs only insofar as each can be exchanged for every other useful kind of private labor. It can count as equal to every other useful kind of private labor. Yeah. Different instances of labor can become fully equal only when their real non-equality is abstracted away. Only when they can be reduced to the common character they have as an expenditure of human labor power, that is, abstract human labor. Abstract human labor, that is. This, the double social character the private labor of private producers, is reflected in the brains of those producers only in the forms that appear in practical dealings, namely the exchange of products. The socially useful character of the producer's labor is thus reflected in the form that their labor products must be useful for others, and the social character of the equality existing among the different instances of labor. The social character of the equality existing among their different instances of labor is reflected in the form of the value character common to their labor products, those physically different things. So people don't put their labor products into relation with one another as values because they regard these things as mere thingly husks that encase homogeneous human labor. It's the other way around. When people exchange their different kinds of products, they equate them as values. And when they do that, they equate their diverse instances of labor as human labor. They know not what they do. Value, then, doesn't come with its name written on its forehead. Instead, it transforms every labor product into a social hieroglyphic. Gee, semiosis, right? Later on, people tried to decipher the meaning of this hieroglyphic to solve the mystery of their own social product. For a useful object's characteristic of being of value is a social product every bit as much as language is. When scholars belatedly discovered that labor products, insofar as their values, are merely thingly expressions of the human labor expended to produce them, this was of epochal importance in the history of human development. But labor's social characteristics retained their appearance of objecthood. That the specific social character of independent instances of private labor consists in their equality as human labor, and that this specific social character takes on the form of labor products' value character, are points valid for only one particular form of production, namely commodity production. Yet to those caught up in the relations of commodity production, these points have seemed definitely valid after the above-mentioned discovery, as they did before it, or just as much as the fact that after scientists broke air down into its component parts, the air form, in the sense of the physical form of the thing, air, remained unaltered. When people exchange products, their first practical concern is how much of the products of others can they get for on their own? It's the inherent question of masturbation, I suppose. In what proportions are they exchanging their products? The moment when these ratios achieve the stability of habit, they seem to arise from the nature of the labor products themselves. For example, a ton of iron and 2 ounces of gold seem to be equal in value, just like a pound of gold and a pound of iron are equal in weight, despite their differences in their physical and chemical properties. But in fact, the value character of labor products becomes truly established only when they begin to function as magnitudes of value. How happy is your happy ending? These magnitudes vary constantly, independently of the will, foreknowledge, and actions of the people exchanging commodities. For these people, their own social movement has the form of the movement of things, which, rather than controlling, they are controlled by. Only once there is fully developed commodity production can experience lead to the following scholarly insight. Instances of private labor carried out independently of one another, but also in many respects interdependent as parts of the social division of labor, continually reduced to the proportions in which society needs them. For here, the labor time socially necessary to make products forcefully asserts itself as a regulative law of nature in the product's accidental, constantly fluctuating exchange ratios, just as the law of gravity does when somebody's house falls on his head. That labor time determines the magnitude of value. That labor time, it determines the magnitude of value is then a secret hidden under the manifest movements in relative commodity values. Once this secret is discovered, labor products' magnitudes of value no longer seem to be determined arbitrarily. But this hardly clears away the thingly form of their determination, which remains in place as much as before. Reflections on the forms of human life, including the scholarly analysis of them, have run directly counter to the real development of those forms. People have begun with the end product of this process of development, that is, post festum. The forms that make labor products into commodities, and thus are, conditions necessary for commodity circulation, have already attained the rootedness of natural forms of social life before people attempt to understand not their historical character, since they've treated these forms as immutable, but rather their content. And so it was solely the analysis of commodity prices that led people to identify how the magnitude of value is determined. And it was solely the shared money expression of commodities led them to identify how commodities' value character is established. Yet it is precisely the money form, the commodity world's finished form, that obscures the social character of private labor, and thus the social relations among private workers, presenting them as relations among things rather than revealing them. If I say that coats, boots, and so on enter into relations where linen acts as the general embodiment of abstract human labor, the insanity of this expression jumps out at us. But when producers of coats, boots, and so on treat linen or gold and silver, it makes no difference. As the general equivalent of their commodities, the relation between their private labor and the social totality of labor presents itself to them in just this absurd form. Such forms make up the categories of bourgeois political economy. These forms of thought are socially valid for, and thus objective with regard to, the relations of production in this historically specific social mode of production, commodity production. And so all the mysticism of the commodity world, all the magic and phantoms enshrouding labor products made on the basis of commodity production disappears the moment we escape to other forms of production. Since political economists love Robinson Crusoe stories, let's begin with Robinson on his island. Although undemanding by nature, he still has wants and needs of different kinds to satisfy, so he's to perform different kinds of useful labor, making tools, building furniture, taming llamas, fishing, hunting, and so on. We will leave out prayer and things like that because our Robinson enjoys them and sees such activities as recreation, not labor. While he engages in a wide range of productive functions, he recognizes that being performed by one and the same Robinson Crusoe, they represent different forms of his own activity and thus merely different modes of human labor. Necessity forces him to divide his time carefully among his different tasks. Whether one takes up more of the total time he spends working and another less depends on the difficulty, large or small, that he has to overcome to achieve the desired useful effect. Experience teaches him this. And good Englishman that he is, having rescued his watch, notebook, ink, and quill pen from this shipwreck, our Crusoe begins to keep a ledger about his life. Its inventory includes a list of his use objects, the different operations needed to produce, and then finally the labor time it takes on average to produce specific quantities of these products. The relations between Robinson and the things that make up his self-created wealth are so simple and transparent that even Mr. Max Worth could understand them without overtaxing his brain. Even its relations contain all the essential determinants of value. Now let's go from Robinson's sunny island to the darkness of medieval Europe. Here we find, rather than an independent man, only dependent men, that is, serfs and lords, vassals and suzerains, laymen and clergy. Personal dependence characterizes the social relations of material production as it does the spheres of life based on this form of production. But precisely because personal relations of dependence constitute the existing social foundation, labor and its products have no need to take on a fantastic form at odds with their reality. They belong to society's economic activity as services and payments in kind. Labor's natural form or particularity is in this case, its directly social form, where its generality is its directly social form under commodity production. Indentured labor can be measured in units of time just as well as commodity producing labor can, but every serf knows that he expends a certain quantity of his own personal labor power in the service of his lord. The tithe the priest receives is easier to see than the blessing he offers. Whatever one thinks of the different actors' masks in which people interact with one another is such a society. At least the social relations among laboring people appear as their personal relations, and they aren't disguised as social relations among things, among labor products. For example of labor in common or directly associated labor, we don't have to go all the way back to the form that arises spontaneously in all civilizations in their earliest stage. An example closer to hand would be the patriarchal rural industry of a peasant family that produces grain, cattle, yarn, linen, clothes, and so on, all to satisfy its own wants and needs. The family interacts with these different things as the various products of its family labor, but the things don't interact with one another as commodities. Well, you could argue that. The different kinds of labor that produce these products, farming, cattle breeding, spinning, weaving, tailoring, and so on, are social functions in their natural form by virtue of being functions of the family, which has its own spontaneously arising division of labor, no less than the system of commodity production does. Differences of age and sex, as well as changes in natural conditions that occur within the seasons, govern both the distribution of the various functions within the family and the labor time individual family members expend. But if the labor power each individual expends is measured in terms of time, here the use of this standard appears by nature as labor's own social characteristics. Because by nature, these individual bearers of labor power function only as organs of the family's common labor power. Finally, let's imagine, for variety's sake, an association of free people using communal means of production and who self-consciously expend their many individual instances of labor power as one social labor power. All the characteristics of Crusoe's labor are present here, too, only as social rather than individual ones. Everything Crusoe produced was nothing but his personal product and therefore served him directly as a use object. The total production of this association of free people is, in contrast, a social product. Part of its product is used as a new means of production. This part remains social. Members of the association consume another part as their means of subsistence, however, and so this latter part must be distributed among them. Now, how it's distributed varies with the social organism of production itself, and also according to the producer's corresponding level of historical development. Now, let's establish a parallel, finally, with commodity production. Let us therefore assume that every producer's share of the means of subsistence is determined by his labor time. Labor time, thus, would play a double role. Its systemic social allotment maintains the right proportions between the association's diverse labor functions and diverse wants and needs. On the other hand, labor time also serves as the measure of how much an individual producer contributes to the common labor. and hence of how much it gets of the consumable part of the common product. The social relations between people and their labor, and also between people and their labor products, retain a transparent simplicity here in production as well as distribution. Which form of religion corresponds most closely to a society of commodity producers, where what constitutes the general social relation of production is that the producers relate to their products as commodities, thus as values, and with their instances of private labor in that thingly form, they bring them into relation with one another, as equal human labor. This distinction belongs to Christianity with its cult of the abstract human being, which is especially pronounced in its bourgeois stage of Protestantism, theism, and so on. In the forms of production we find in ancient Asia and classical antiquity, the transformation of products into commodities played a marginal role, and thus so did commodity production as a way of life. Although both became more important, the more the communal character of these societies declined. Like the gods of Epicurus, real trading peoples exist only in the intermundia of the ancient world or in its pores, like the Jews in Polish society. These older social organisms of production are far simpler and more transparent than their bourgeois counterparts, but they're based either on the immaturity of the individual person who hasn't yet ripped himself free of the umbilical cord of his natural species connection with fellow humans, or on a direct relationship of domination and servitude. Meet the election. Such organisms of production are conditioned by the low level of development reached by labor's productive forces and the correspondingly limited relations of people within the process of creating and maintaining material life. That is, their relations both to nature and with one another. This real limitation appears in imaginary form in old nature and folk religions. The religious mirroring of the real world won't vanish until the workaday world's practical relations become consistently transparent, rational relations among people and between people and nature. The form of the social life process, i.e. the material production process, will not shed its foggy shroud of mystery until it becomes the product of freely associated people, consciously planned and controlled by them. But for this to happen, a society must attain a certain material basis or multiple material conditions of existence, which will arise spontaneously from a long and painful history of development. Political economy has, in fact, analyzed value and magnitude of value, though not at all exhaustively, and uncovered the content hidden in these forms. But it is not ever posed the question of why this content takes that form, why labor is represented in value, and the measure of labor in terms of duration represents the labor product's magnitude of value. Formulas clearly mark as belonging to a social formation whose production process controls people, and isn't yet under their control, or as much a self-evident natural necessity in the bourgeois consciousness of political economy as productive labor itself. Political economy thus deals with pre-bourgeois forms of the social organization of production more or less as the church fathers dealt with pre-Christian religion. So let me stop there for a moment without discussing dull, fatuous debates and other matters. We're close to the end. So I will, I don't know. I can stop there. You can finish reading because we're almost to the end. The end appears here. But in order to avoid jumping ahead, we'll have to content ourselves with one further example relating to the commodity form itself. If commodities could talk, they would say, although our use value may interest people, it doesn't belong to us as things. What does belong to us as things is our value. How we interact as commodity things proves that this is so. We relate to one another only as exchange values. Now, if your pet says that, you'll be learning something. Now, listen to how the souls of commodities speak through the mouths of political economists. Value, that is exchange value, is a property of things, riches of man. Value in this sense necessarily implies exchanges. Riches do not. Riches, use value, are an attribute of man. Value is an attribute of commodities. A man or a community is rich. A pearl or a diamond is valued. A pearl or a diamond has value as a pearl or a diamond. No chemist has, well, they have, no chemist has ever studied a pearl or a diamond and found exchange value there. Yet, while bragging about their special critical depth, the political economists who discovered this chemical substance find that use value belongs to things independently of their properties as things, whereas their value belongs to them as things. What confirms them in this belief is the peculiar circumstance that the use value of things is realized for people without exchange. Hence, in the direct relation between a thing and a person. With the value of things, it's the other way around. Value is realized only in exchange. That is a social process. Here, one can't help but think of good old Dogberry, who gives this advice to the night watchman, Seacole. To be a well-favored man is the gift of fortune, but to read and write comes by nature. Okay, so I'll stop there. Obviously, I've yammered far too much. Let me see if there are questions and comments. Not many. I think you're right, Joe. It is a lot of hair splitting. But I do hope that this can be worthwhile for people to read it. It does make sense, and I'm sure there's not so much a translation, but it's probably in Russian or Chinese, is how to explain the first chapter of Capital, Volume 1, for kids. But actually, I think it's there. All of the components are there. So that would be my comment on this matter. And of course, I went the hell over time. And why don't I stop share and get off the live stream so